When I was immigrating from the former Soviet Union to America, we had to go through Austria and Italy first. In each of these countries, we spent a month or two, and then coming to America. And I was just 14 years old. This was a very long time ago. And one thing that you learn as you come to a certain country is you have to learn what the currency is and what the prices are to try to balance the budget. At that time, the Soviet government would only allow you to take out $300. That's what we had. Me and my mom and I only had $300 with us, and we had a little bit of other money, which I'm not going to go into right now, how we balanced our budget. But the point is that when we came to Austria, we had to figure out what their currency is and get accustomed. And that's true about any country, and a person might be living even in the same country. If there's a huge inflation, they have to constantly change in their minds the equivalency of what you could buy for what amount of money and how much you should spend on what. So a lot of times when we learn the Talmud, we want to ask ourselves, what were the prices in those times? And how much were the salaries? Just to understand, there are so many examples in the Mishnah, in the Talmud, and various other sources, and the examples are taken from their everyday life. Nobody would give an example of a person who is renting an apartment for $1 million a month, or for 10 cents a month. The prices are generally the prices that used to exist in their times. A lot of times you even get the range. For instance, it says that umanim, the daf yomi cycle of learning of the Talmud, is soon going to get to the perek, to the chapter hasocheret umanim, somebody who hires workers. And it's going to discuss that the prices that the workers were paid per day used to range between 3 and 4 dinarim, 3 or 4 dinars, or zuz. Zuz is the same as dinar. They used to get 3 or 4 dinars a day, a skilled worker. Of course, they used to work more than 8 hours a day, generally speaking. So we want to know, what is this? What is 3 or 4 dinars? What could you buy for that amount of money? So that's why I decided to make a small shiur, a small lesson about the currencies and prices in those times. So one thing you have to remember, there are a lot of different coins mentioned in Chazal. And you don't have to remember all of these, but you'd have to remember the smallest coin. Right? In America, it's a penny. In Israel, in those times, the smallest coin was called pruta. And a lot of laws apply, of course, to pruta, to the smallest coin. This is the smallest amount of money. And we have to understand that, of course, the inflation was very small, if ever existing, in those times. Because since all the money was from metals, you couldn't just print out as much money as you wanted. So therefore, the inflation was minimal. It would take maybe hundreds of years when the prices of gold or silver changed a little bit. So over the time, until now, the prices of silver did change quite a bit, as I'll explain in a moment. And what you could buy today for the amount of silver that the equivalent of pruta had. Pruta was not a silver coin, it was a copper coin, but the amount of silver in milligrams or whatever that the equivalent of that coin would buy, for that amount of silver today you can't buy anything. In fact, it's relatively easy to calculate that the pruta was probably less than 2 cents today in terms of how much silver you could buy on a pruta. Now, today if you go in America into any supermarket, there's nothing that the price says 2 cents. And even if you divide, if you buy something bulk, like 12 eggs or whatever, they come out to be maybe 20 cents each or something. I remember just a few years ago, you could buy an egg on average for just 6 cents. 12 eggs used to cost less than $1, but not anymore. Right now, the prices for anything at all would be more like 10 to 20 cents or a quarter, not 1 or 2 cents. So the cents are pretty useless today. But in terms of silver, as I said, pruta was just equivalent of 2 cents, very little. So therefore, we have to try to understand what the actually buying power of money used to be, not how much silver equivalent was. And that, I think, depends on the prices and on the salaries. And then we could actually compare. So I propose to multiply everything by about 10, maybe a little bit more than 10. So a pruta would be equivalent to maybe 20 or 25 cents. Again, this is not the amount of silver. This is just the amount of buying power. You could buy a fruit or 2 fruits sometimes, or maybe more, depending on, some fruits are very, very cheap in various places. You could see in Gemara Kiddushin that sometimes a few dates used to cost a pruta. But at any rate, 1 date was definitely less than a pruta, unless it was very rare exclusion situation. So definitely buying power of a pruta was at least a quarter or close to it. How much did a person make per day? Well, we just said a professional worker used to make 3 or 4 dinarim. Each dinar is 192 prutas. So according to this, a person would be making somewhere in the equivalent of today's salaries, close to $200 a day. And again, I'm not talking about the amount of silver equivalent of their salaries. I'm talking about the buying power, which we're multiplying everything by 10 or more, a little bit more than 10 maybe. So if the pruta is equivalent to a quarter or close to a quarter, then 4 times 192 prutas would be around $200. If it's 3 dinars, then it's a little bit less. So that's more or less like today's salaries. So what were the prices for various items? Again, I'm going on the assumption that the buying power of a pruta is about 20-something cents. And we'll see how it makes a lot of sense based on the salaries, as we just mentioned, based on daily salaries, and based on what you could buy for it. So here are a few examples in various parts of the Talmud that I found. There are more examples of this, but I'm just giving you a few different ones. So the Mishnah tells us that one could buy a core. A core is about 200 to 300 liters. It's a volume of wheat for 1 gold dinar. Golden dinar was equivalent to 25 silver dinars. So silver dinar, as I mentioned, is 192 prutas. So we have to multiply all that by another 25. So core of wheat, 300 or less liters of wheat, would cost 25 silver dinars. That comes out to 1 silver dinar for about 10 liters of wheat. Now, the whole prices today are much lower when you buy lots and lots of bushels of wheat. But if you're buying in the store, then it's already pretty close. It's not that expensive that the wheat was compared to today. Again, I'm comparing the buying power based on person's salaries. So the price today in a store of a package of wheat, let's say, would be pretty close, maybe slightly cheaper. On the other hand, the real estate was actually cheaper than today. Of course, their real estate was simpler. It didn't include all kinds of running water and stuff like that we have today. So renting an apartment meant it was just the house sitting on the ground with walls and roof. That's all you were getting. But it was pretty cheap. So here are a couple of examples. One from our tractate, it was again in the cycle of Daf Yomi, just recently, 65th Daf. It mentions that one could rent a yard, a chatzer, an open space outside of the house that could be rented for a Selah, which is 4 dinarim per month. So something like $200 a month. Okay, it's like today you would rent a garageway maybe or something, just a space. Now, with regards to a bathhouse, it says it used to cost 1 golden dinar a month. So that's the equivalent of $1,250 a month. That's for a whole bathhouse. And a cow could cost 30 dinarim. That's about $1,500. It sounds pretty reasonable today too. Right? That's also in Bava Metzia and 69th Daf. Now, the clothing was much more expensive. We could see in Gemara Ketubot that clothing was more expensive than today. That makes a lot of sense because today all clothing is mass-produced. And at that time, everybody had to do everything manually. So clothing was incredibly expensive. People didn't change clothing just like that today. You know, you have a lot of different coats and a lot of different shirts. That was not the case at all. A person would buy something and use it for years and years. So my conclusion in all of this, these were just a few examples. I don't want to bother you with many more examples of this, but my conclusion is that generally speaking, they didn't live that poorly. I mean, of course, life was much more difficult than today. There's not even a discussion when the light was candlelight and the water was not running water, no showers and stuff like that. Of course, life was difficult, but given that this is how they lived anyway, the basic human needs, a place to live, something to eat, those things were not terribly expensive. In some cases, they were even a little bit cheaper, certain fruits and On the other hand, there's actually a Gemara that they used to buy in Babylonia. They used to buy a whole basket of dates for one dinar. So the truth is that their life was not terrible. That was, of course, under all the good times. There were times of hunger. There were times of when there was no rain for a while and people fasted. All of that existed too. They didn't have artificial ways to irrigate the fields. But when the times were fine, people lived basically okay. They could provide for their families, and most people were not hungry all the time. In fact, when Jews ended up in Europe, it became worse. In many cases, it was in Europe that hunger was more common because of the fact that the weather was such in northern Europe, like Belarus, where my ancestors come from. Jews went to Germany first and surrounding areas, and then ended up in Eastern Europe, in Poland, and later when Poland was divided between Russia and other countries, some ended up in Belarus, part of Russia. So in those areas, it was so cold that you couldn't grow that much fruits at all. So there were no cheap dates like in Israel or Babylonia. Babylonia is Iraq. None of these things existed, and they were able to get bread, but it was very expensive, and of course people lived very, very poorly. But while our ancestors lived in ancient times in Israel and later in Babylon, they lived okay, even by today's standards, compared to how much they made per day and how much they were able to buy. And if you like this video, please press like.